Hello, everyone. Welcome. Seeing folks dial in now. Thank you for being here. My name is Mary. I work for Tech Talent South. We are a tech education company that exists to build and connect tech and entrepreneurial ecosystems. We do that in a few ways. We provide technical training for individuals. We provide technical training for corporations, and we help to meet talent acquisition needs through workforce development and talent placement programs. We also host a lot of great events, admittedly one of my favorite things that we do. Tonight we get to feature Molly Kramer, the principal at Model Content. She's leading a talk, as you all know, called Empathy, the most valuable UX tool. For those just dialing in, please be submitting questions throughout the event. We want to hear from you. We're going to save some time at the end for Q&A, so don't be afraid to submit them now, either through the Q&A box or the chat, and we'll be sure to get to them at the end. Without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic over to Molly, and you can take it away. Thanks, Molly.
All right. Thank you, Mary. Welcome, everybody. I hope that everyone on this call is doing well. Thank you so much to Tech Talent South for having me. Again, I'm Molly. I'm the principal at Model Content, which is a content marketing agency for health and tech. And we do writing, design, web development, and video to help our clients provide value to their customers before they convert, and then deepen that relationship with that throughout the customer journey. And my role on the team is I do content strategy, I do some user research, some editing, and a lot of project management. So one of my first communications jobs was in a corporation that did not have a UX department. And I was doing projects for every department in the company, working with a team of really talented people. But there was one department whose project requests always filled me with dread, because it always went the same way. They couldn't really articulate what they wanted on the front end. The higher up who wanted the project in the first place never made themselves available. It was all secondhand information, no opportunity to ask follow-up questions. So I'd turn around a comp, and then there were change requests, and we'd make them and send them back, and there'd be more change requests and more change requests, and sometimes this even went on for months. So with this department, we were really in the business of deliverables. It just felt like we never got to build the thing that they actually wanted in the first place. That department was basically a stranger to us. We didn't have any data on what they or their users wanted. My frustration in that situation was 100% why I got into UX. So after that, I went back to reflect on some of my previous research experiences. I worked at libraries. I was very briefly a biologist. I went back to school for public health and communications, which uses completely different kind of research. And then I was a reporter for several years. So I had this sort of toolbox that I hadn't opened in a while. And the thing about these tools is they vary widely in terms of rigor. And what I use now is kind of a good enough version of a mishmash of these tools, because I work in a reality of timelines. Timelines for launching sites and pushing out content. And so I can make the argument that we should extend those timelines somewhat by saying that, you know, I'm going to bring you information that you don't have, and we're going to be making better decisions together if we do a little research. But I can't extend the timelines long enough to do, you know, the kind of research that would be accepted to a peer-reviewed publication. So the approach I'm going to talk about is a compromise between timeliness and rigor, and all with the goal of developing user empathy. So first of all, empathy is not telepathy. It's not magic. It's not a talent that a few people are born with. It's actually a skill you can cultivate. Empathy is simply the ability to imagine yourself in another person's position. But if you don't know anything about that person, then you can't have true empathy with them. And it's not because you're a sociopath, it's you just don't know anything about them. And so then your brain is going to fill in the blanks with fiction and tell you that it's the truth. And that's why user research is so important. Finding out surprising information can really crack open those hardened assumptions and inspire a further desire for evidence. So model content uses techniques that anybody on this call can use. I know that's true because model content has coached other companies in adopting these tools. I've taught engineers how to use these tools. So all you need is curiosity and basic spreadsheet skills. So first we're going to talk about doing user research when you can't collect user data. And we're going to talk about doing basic user research when you do have access to that data or direct access to users. And then we're going to talk about launching a basic usability testing program. So if you work in user experience full time, that means you work at a company that values it. And we don't all have that situation. So first I'm going to mention some basic concepts of UX. I'm going to drop in a lot of terminology. So if you want to take a deeper dive into these things, you'll know what search terms to use. And I'm going to go step by step through some methodologies that will get you as far as possible without access to user data. So people interact with things based on mental models that they've created from their own experience. So when a user interacts with your thing, they're going to apply their own mental model to it. If their interaction leads to a good outcome, that means you've done a great job of designing an interaction model that conforms to their idea of how a thing should work. So a little investigation on the front end can help you really develop an informed hypothesis about your users' interaction models. And the other hypothesis you're trying to build at this point is about your users' visual norms. And this is hugely important. People will reject a highly usable thing based on how it looks. If you make a product that's in a certain market, it's too far outside of what products look in that market typically, you're just going to face a big burden of educating your consumer, and you're going to have to do it before they're even engaged enough with you to really endure that education. And so they're just not going to stop at your booth or click on your link, and they're not going to upgrade to get that cool new feature you're building. So they'll never get to the point of giving it a try. But to be clear, I just want to stop and say I'm not telling you that you shouldn't innovate. You should absolutely innovate. You just need to be aware of your audience's visual expectations so that they can experience some level of immediate recognition of the usability of your product. So how do you start investigating their mental models and visual norms? The first step is to map out your user's journey. Depending on your project, this is either going to be the journey to or through your product. So it's like a treasure map that leads to your user's goal. Not to purchasing your product, but to the user getting what they need. So first, what's their goal? And then second, what is the sequence of actions that they take to achieve that goal? For marketing, understanding this journey is a basic step to figuring out your pipeline stages. This is what that looks like in HubSpot when you're setting up your pipeline stages. Mapping out what marketers call a customer journey can also help you identify information gaps you might have related to what kind of tools or content or channels that you need to focus on. In product design, mapping out what's called a user flow is a fundamental step to tell you what screens you're going to have to build. It's a really practical step. So don't worry at this point about whether each of these actions would take place on the same or a different screen. Just map out each action the user would take and put them in the right order. And this is one that was created in Overflow, I believe is the name of it, something somebody recommended to me recently. When you're first sketching it out, paper works fine for this. I like to do it on the first draft on a whiteboard with the client in the room. This is a user flow for a forensics DNA tool used by criminal justice labs. And the journey has a lot of digital touch points, but it's also got a complicated onboarding process that takes place in a lab. So really complicated customer journey, but we just started by talking and sketching it out. And then once this meeting is done, I'll just take a picture, I'll go back to my office, I'll flesh it out. I use Adobe InDesign, and the next iteration of it will look like this, or something like this. And so immediately we generated some valuable insights about the UX during the purchasing and onboarding process. And we also identified several touch points that were occurring manually that we could automate. So that could result in faster, potentially higher quality interactions for the user. So if you're a UX pro, you probably noticed that I don't use a recognizable set of symbols in my flows. Also, I really like words. I'm coming from a writing background, so I will put some narrative into the version that I send to my clients. People don't seem to have a problem with that, so I think it just goes to show that you can make this process your own. But here's a more typical looking user flow. This is a template from Lucidchart, which is a tool I use all the time. And I often use Lucidchart to create that first collaborative draft when it's not possible to use a whiteboard. And I also use it for sitemaps. It's really good for that. So, okay, at this point, your user flow is mapped out. So now it's time to dig into your ecosystem and investigate your users' norms. And a lot of very good designers take an informal approach here to looking at their ecosystem, just some purposeful browsing and then right into sketching. When I'm just browsing like that, I just feel like I'm whizzing past a lot of data without digesting it. So I'm going to describe a method called content analysis. And I was trained to do this in an academic setting, but my professors would not recognize the way I do it now as valid. I have a very lean, very informal version of it. You do not need to be an academic to do my version of content analysis, but it's also less rigorous. It's meant to be followed by usability testing, but you should be doing that anyway. So first, an overview on the theory. So content analysis is a common research tool that's used in communications and public health, which is my background. If you've heard of affinity diagramming, that's a kind of content analysis. The link here goes to a description of the way one studio does it, and their approach is incredibly involved, much more so than mine, but they outline their steps in a really detailed and practical way. So you can apply this to any kind of content, like any kind of content on the planet. So they're using it to digest interview transcripts. But you can apply content analysis to historical documents or user interfaces, which is what I'm talking about. So you just break that content down into code categories so you can identify meaningful characteristics of it. So content analysis can be quantitative or qualitative. In my content analysis, I use a mostly qualitative approach. And so quantitative is just, for those of you who don't have research backgrounds, refers to methods that are more focused on numbers. Qualitative is more focused on insights. Qualitative research can be used on its own, or it can be used as the basis for subsequent quantitative research, which is how we're using it here. So like any approach to content analysis, grounded theory has elements found in good scientific research. So you're thinking validity, generalizability, reliability. But there's a big difference that I want you to think about between the kind of research I'm describing and the kind that normally takes place in a lab. And that is that grounded theory is inductive rather than deductive. So the difference is just whether the data or the theory comes first. In most scientific research, you develop a theory and some sort of generalization about the world, and then you start gathering data to verify it or falsify it, and that's deductive reasoning. With grounded theory, you just start collecting and analyzing the data, and you let the theory rise organically out of it. It's like it's what Sherlock Holmes uses. You know, he walks around the world just like making observations, and then he has that moment. And it's an incredibly satisfying process when you have one of those breakthroughs. You come up with some great insight, and you know that you're going to be able to persuade your stakeholders because you'll have the data. You've been collecting it the whole time. So now I'm going to explain exactly how to do it. It's so simple. It's just one spreadsheet and one collaborative doc. I use Google Docs. So the spreadsheet is your competition analysis, and this is a common research tool in marketing. By looking at the brands and interfaces that play a comparable role to yours, you can get insights on your users' expectations, for both interactions and for visuals. So the rows are you and your comparable products. So I do want to say that competitor can be a misnomer here, especially if you're, doing something really innovative. There might not be a company out there that's exactly apples to apples to yours. This is just about, comparing yourself to, other products that have some meaningful comparison. Maybe you're even looking at the analog version of some digital product that you're creating, or maybe you're looking at another digital product that serves the same audience. And then the columns are the metrics that you're going to be collecting, and this just completely depends on the project. You can imagine a spreadsheet like this can get huge, especially if you're like designing a whole brand or a whole new business. So try to set some limits for yourself on the outset. And then from here, you just start filling in the cells. And I would also set a limit for yourself here so you don't sort of spin. Maybe spend 1 hour, 2 hours per row, even if you don't finish it, and then you can come back at the end when you have a refined sense of what's important and your categories have started to emerge. And that's it. You just keep putting one foot in front of the other, and you'll have your Sherlock Holmes moment. So memoing is a fundamental part of grounded theory. So researchers will often refer to this as open coding. And as you're filling out your spreadsheet, you're going to come across a lot of visuals that you can capture with screenshots. So you just drop those into a file that you can share with your whole team. So you'll have multiple people contributing to this. I mean, unless you're working on your own. And you include with each one, you want to at least include the company name, just include a short note just to illustrate the significance of it, because this is going to be a resource for weeks, months, and you may not remember when you come back to it why it was important in the first place. If possible, take a screenshot of each step. So if you're looking at an app and you're looking at a user flow, try to take a screenshot of every step, every screen. Or if you're working in marketing, get a snap of the ad and the landing page and the confirmation page and store the collateral somewhere that you downloaded. So now that you've collected all this data, how do you communicate it to your user or your boss or your internal customer or whatever? You can't send them a spreadsheet. So this is where marketing personas come in. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this concept. It's simply a customer modeling practice that combines research and storytelling, which are two of my favorite things. And each of these personas is just basically, they're just like a bundle of hypotheses that are kind of mashed into the form of a person. And just like flowcharts, personas can be used for marketing or for usage. So you can be modeling purchase motivations or usage behaviors here. The most common use I have for them is messaging architecture. So I'll cross-reference the customer journey we created with the marketing personas and create some key messaging for each stage of the customer journey. And in most UX pros practice, I believe, marketing personas come late in the game, like after you've already defined your user groups, even after you've started collecting user data. But I do it early, and that's because you can use these to define your user groups in a much better way, so you can maybe more effectively recruit research participants. You'll have a better sense of where they go, what social media channels they use, etc. And the other advantage of doing marketing personas early is you sort of rapidly generate some actually informed hypotheses about your users' mental models. So just communicate that these are provisional models, they can change, they can evolve, that's fine. The format, you can see, like in other situations, I use a lot of text, but other people don't. The format varies widely. You can find a template online if you're more of a visual person. I present it as a very short story and then just get client reactions to it. And that itself can be a really insightful meeting because it turns into sort of a focus group where people are really able to open up in even more depth about what they know or what they think they know about their users. You want to include whatever are the most relevant user attributes for your project. You're always going to include some demographics, some level of their individual backstory. You may want to make a note in the persona of like how frequently they use your tool or how frequently they perform the tasks that your tool is going to perform. If it's a B2B product, you definitely want to include their title, some element of the corporate backstory. Then no matter what your project, you always want to try to include some digging into their pain points. Now, you still don't have all of that information. Some of it's going to come up during the competition analysis, and some will still, be blanks that you have to fill in. So if you can't do a survey, where do you get that data? Well, there are tons of good sources. And the first one that you should look to, if this is for an existing business, is your own CRM, your own analytics, your own staff. So like, what are the sales and usage trends? What are the demographics of your best customers? Talk to the people, not just the people in the C-suite, but talk to people on the front lines, people in customer success, people in sales, for sure. Okay, and so then there's always some research reports out there you can buy, and there's a reason they cost so much. They're very good. Forrester is an example of this kind of thing, Ibis World. And then, another tool that I use that is paid is have an SEO tool that's really valuable. And I use SEMrush. There's a bunch of them out there. Ahrefs, Ahrefs is one I've used before. It's good. What I use that tool for in this context is to look at my competitors' websites, see what's the most, what pages get the most traffic. And I also look at what keywords are driving the most traffic for them, because both of those things can really point you to your users' pain points, because it shows like, what solutions are they looking for and what's the language that they use to find those solutions. And you can drill down by demographics too. Okay, and then free research databases. PubMed is really good for health, Google Scholar. Academic dissertations are often totally free, full text from universities. And your public library, if you don't have a library card, you should get one. They're gonna offer you a range of databases for free. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to be able to access the text that you want, but yeah, you can search. And I would definitely try to search for content analyses when you're doing your search, because if there's a researcher out there who's already done interviews with the audience that you're interested or on the topic that you're interested in, you can actually lift those quotes and use them in your marketing personas and in your presentations to clients. Third-party review sites. So if you're in software, then this would be like Capterra or GetApp, or especially whatever marketplace your product would be sold on. So, like the Salesforce App Exchange or the Oculus Store or whatever. And that's going to be a great source of quotes as well. People can get on and just like vent about what they're frustrated about, will say what they want, etc. Trade publications. So, any kind of a news publication that's really caters to a specific industry niche. And again, here, I would go straight for the interviews, interviews with award winners, interviews with thought leaders, and use those quotes. Trade associations are a great source for high quality original research, and some of it's going to be behind the wall, but some of it's not. Okay, federal agencies. So obviously the census is a wealth of data as far as demographics and location. The CDC is really great for population health. When I'm doing research for a B2B product, I always use the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They really break down labor force stats by age, race, and ethnicity, gender. Really helps to flesh out your persona and make that person more real. And also they break state level income down by, they break income data down by state. Just lots of really good information. All right, think tanks. The Kaiser Family Foundation is a good one for health. LinkedIn and job search sites is one I always go to for B2B as well. So you can get a really good idea of what a typical career path is for the person who's at the heart of your persona. What degrees would they have? for job post sites, you can even find out, you know, like what are their daily responsibilities, which is a really strong signal to what their pain points are. Nonprofit think tanks, yeah. The RAND corporations are really good for a variety of topics. One to go back to over and over here is the Pew Research Center, has a lot of good research on a variety of topics, but they also are pretty closely watching social media consumption, and they break it down by demographics, and I believe it's updated every year. And then content marketing, a lot of companies are putting out, you know, high quality original research, obviously to luring customers, but you can use it for whatever purpose you like. And I would always recommend, I'm a former librarian, and I know that librarians have tools that, you know, not everybody knows about. So, I mean, if you get stuck, just go talk to one about your research goals. So this is data sources for indirect user research, and y'all are going to get a copy of these slides. The general flow I've described so far is basically what model content's front end process looks like whenever we engage with someone. And like I said, the client always finds out things they never knew, and we're also able to make better decisions as we move forward, because really every business is different. So now we're going to talk about how to launch a basic user research program when you do have access to users, and this really emphasizes doing interviews. And there's really just no substitute for user data. So here's how you get it when you don't yet have a product to test. And so we'll pick up where we stopped with our personas. So all of that initial research will help you to tell a more realistic story about your user. And now you've got user groups that are more likely to be useful through the point at which you're collecting user data, and, you know, or even starting your design work. And this is going to save you some iteration later. So like I said, each of these characters is basically a bunch of well-informed hypotheses, like molded into a personal narrative. But at some point you need to put those hypotheses to the test. And the best way to gather this type of really foundational evidence is through original research out in the field. So just go talk to your customers. Interviews and other qualitative methods are a great way to build empathy. It really inspires you to create solutions that are truly user-centered when you've been, you know, sitting face-to-face with the person who's gonna be relying on it. And you do not have to be a professional interviewer to do this. And to illustrate that, I'm going to talk about Lean Startup, which is an entrepreneurship methodology that combines interviews with agile development. And this program is actually designed for people who do not have a UX background. So the Lean Startup approach uses interviews to test hypotheses about key aspects of a business model as a whole. So it has a pretty broad scope. If you're doing this program in a rigorous way, you're going to do at least 100 interviews, probably a lot more. If you're just developing a new feature for an existing business, you don't need to do nearly as many. But through these conversations, you're going to get a ton of really valuable insights. So think back to grounded theory, which is inductive. And you start with the data, you let the theory emerge from the data collection, and that's a really common approach that UX designers take with interview transcripts. The approach Lean Startup takes with interviews is different. It's deductive, like most scientific research. So you develop a hypothesis, a generalization about your business model, and you go out into the world and test it. At the same time, it's kind of got some inductive qualities as well, because you're letting each new piece of information open you up to new hypotheses. So people are going to say things in these interviews that hadn't even occurred to you as a possibility. In Lean Startup, this interview approach is called customer discovery. It allows you to really rapidly process a lot of insights from a lot of interviews. So this is a business model canvas. It was developed by Eric Ries. It's often used along with Steve Blank's customer-centered research model. And this is what I use when I'm working with a company that hasn't yet commercialized. So each section of the canvas contains hypotheses about important parts of your business. So in the upper right-hand block is where you've got all the hypotheses that are most relevant for UX. You've got value propositions, customer relationships, customer segments and channels. Then other parts, you get key activities and resources, key partners, cost structure, revenue streams. And the centerpiece of Lean Startup, of the business model canvas, is really value propositions. That's what everybody's trying to figure out about their own technology when they go through a program like this. And it's the relationship between the value propositions and the customer segments is where you get that product market fit, which is a term you've probably heard. So you can download your own business model canvas for free online, or just recreate this on a whiteboard. And then you fill in each of these blanks with hypotheses about how your business can succeed. And you go out of your building, you talk to people, ask a bunch of questions. When that interview is still fresh in your mind, you look through your notes for any data that verifies or falsifies your hypotheses. And if you keep getting negative data on a hypothesis, you've got to pivot. And that's exactly what happens to most businesses if they're using Lean Startup correctly. So this canvas was for a piece of education technology that we at first thought might have a B2C sales cycle, business to consumer. This product was an augmented reality board game for learning math. So the founder of this company, her color code is a little bit confusing to me. It's the red ones that are the really well supported hypotheses, and the light blue ones were basically, we accepted them as false. And you can see that one I've highlighted here is a hypothesis that our customer segments would include parents and students, specifically from 3-year-old kindergarten to 7th grade, especially ones who are struggling with math. And we set up tables in parenting hotspots all over Atlanta, and we talked to one after another who repeatedly told us that they never play educational board games with their kids or even look for these kinds of products. Doesn't matter how well their kids are doing. And so educational augmented reality was a non-starter. So, okay, that was valuable data, and we pivoted to schools. And then we did tons of interviews with teachers. And teachers buy a lot of educational board games, and they have a lot to say about it. So we talked to them about their frustrations in the classroom, what are the different pools of funding that they can pull from, how they make their purchasing decisions, often happens as a team, and what channels they use. So much good data. So testing your assumptions through interviews can be really effective. And you don't need to use a business model canvas. I'm not saying that. Just write your hypotheses down, draft a set of questions that will test those hypotheses, and then keep score somehow. And here are some more tips on interviews. Okay, the first one is to make a question list. Sometimes people are really resistant to this, but otherwise you're not going to cover everything because you have limited time with this person. And that's not to say that your question list won't change. It's going to evolve. So just make sure, just adjust it, And if multiple people are going out and doing interviews separately, just make sure that they all have access to the most up-to-date question list when they go out into the field. Just invest in a reporter. You may not want to apply some really rigorous method of content analysis to your interviews now, but that doesn't mean you won't want to do that in a year from now. So just capture that data. So sample size is much less important in qualitative than it is in quantitative research. It's still important, but it really just depends on the project, how many user groups you have, how much money you have to travel. So the Nielsen-Norman Group is a firm that's really influential in the world of UX, and Jacob Nielsen, one of the leaders of that, had a great quote that the difference between 0 and even a little bit of data is astounding. So that would be a tip, is just to get started. If you have more than one interviewer in a single session, definitely set roles. One person is going to be the primary interviewer, the other person will be the scribe, and anybody else who's not the primary interview should definitely wait until they're invited by the primary interviewer to ask questions, because it can be jumping in can be disruptive. Ask open-ended questions. Once you get people to sit down with you, it is easier than you'd think to get them to open up, because people like to talk about themselves, they like to talk about their work. But if you ask them a yes or no question, you're basically cutting them off. So draft your initial question list, go through to spot any yes/no questions, and then reword them to be open-ended. And here's some easy clues. If you start a question with how, what, why, or tell me about, then that's an open-ended question, and you're going to get much richer data. Ask people what they've done in the past. What was their experience interacting with a brand or performing a task? Ask people what approach they currently take. Avoid asking people to speculate about what they would do in the future. That data is just not as reliable. Don't get straight to talking about your feature or your software or whatever. Start the interview by developing some of that other data that's critical to a good marketing persona. So again, the most important thing is to try to dig into their pain points, their problems, their frustrations. Save any specific questions about your feature for the end, if at all. Because at this point, we're doing really foundational research. We don't want to bias our subject. So honestly, even if you have a prototype or a wireframe for this situation, I would avoid the temptation to bring it out. It's really important to deviate from the script, and in some circumstances in particular. And one of those is to ask follow-up questions. If you pick up on any kind of strong emotion, if somebody says something that you've never heard before, if they say something that's not clear to you, all of those are really good reasons to probe more deeply. Interview them in person. Body language is a really large component of communication. You can communicate your own openness and curiosity towards them, and they can communicate when they're feeling some kind of emotion about the topic, some frustration or some excitement. And if you can interview them in the setting that's actually relevant to your product, so, the kitchen or the grocery store or their office, you can bring in some of the benefits of contextual inquiry or ethnographic research. Those are other qualitative methods you may want to look into. You can actually see how the environment influences the use of the product. Or you can even, when they start to tell you about how they do something, you can just say, show me, and walk over and have them demonstrate how the workflow goes. And you get incredibly rich data from that. Okay, so that's all of them. Those are my interview tips. So I just really love doing interviews. I love hearing people tell their story. If you do as well, then that's a strong signal that you'll be good at UX, because curiosity is just fundamentally important. So interviews are not the only option. There's contextual inquiry, like I mentioned. There's focus groups, card sorting, exercises. I was just exploring a really cool tool on optimalworkshop.com for a remote card sorting tool. And no matter what route you take to test your hypotheses about your user groups, at the end, you're gonna have much better empathy than when you started, because you're gonna be taking action to understand their perspective rather than just designing based on your assumptions. And during design, you're going to be much better equipped to spot the friction points, sources of error, sources of abandonment, as well as sources of satisfaction and delight that you can offer by creating an interaction model that solves their problems and conforms to their mental model. So that's how you launch a basic user research program using interviews. Just start asking questions and listening. Okay, so far we've been talking about foundational research at the beginning of a project, but once you've got something to share, like a concept or a staging site or something, it's time to get feedback. And usability testing can be very complicated and very expensive. So what I'm going to focus on today is just getting a basic program started. There are a lot of ways to get feedback on what you've created. But here, just as in interviews, it's important to go into it with the right mindset. Don't be afraid of negative data. Just reorient your mind to look at negative data for the value that it has. It's going to save your butt to find out early in the process that you configured something in a way that's going to result in a bunch of errors. Fantastic, you can fix it now. So the first thing I would do is go back to your user flow. This is a user flow we showed at the very beginning. By now, it's probably significantly evolved. So just pull your key performance indicators out of here. where are the points that people are most likely to drop off? What are the user actions in this flow that equate to success, such as creating an account, maybe completing a training flow, or exporting something or publishing something, whatever. So you just start counting those events on the back end. But you can always get more granular in the way that people are interacting with what you've built. So for websites and apps, the simplest tool is Google Analytics. And this is one of my favorite Google Analytics reports. This is the behavior flow report, which can really surprise you by showing some of the ways that people are moving through your site and find out, well, that's not the way I designed it at all. The standard version of Google Analytics is totally free. You should never launch a website without setting up Google Analytics. It is heartbreaking to go to work with someone and ask for access to their analytics, and they haven't even set it up. And so it's been like, 3 or whatever years of data. It could have given us a good baseline, all kinds of insights about our users, and it's completely lost because it doesn't work retroactively. If you want to dig deeper, you can layer on additional analytics. One step beyond Google Analytics is working with a tag manager like Google Tag Manager or Mixpanel. It does require basic coding skills. A really simple tool that anybody can use is heat maps. I use Hotjar. You can see how far people are scrolling down the page. If there's a big drop off at a certain point, there's something to fix. Hotjar comes with click maps, so you can literally see where people are clicking around on the screen trying to do something that's just not there. So you can add the functionality that people want. And these are all things, tag managers and heat maps, that you don't have to recruit research participants for. You don't need to create a question list. You just sit back and passively collect the data. It's just a no-brainer. You shouldn't have a product out there that you haven't built some kind of passive testing into. And then there are a lot of ways to build more active usability testing into your project. So this is a screenshot from a tool called Loop 11, but there are tons of these kinds of platforms out there. And it lets you set tasks for people who are interacting with your product and then survey them. So you can capture screen recordings or even the user's audio and video if they consent. And you can ask them survey questions about the usability of the site as it regards performing that specific user flow. And some of these tools recruit participants for you from their panel of testers, or you can install a pop-up form to recruit people in the act of using your site. And you can configure questions in a variety of ways, multiple choice, rating, ranking. You can gather Net Promoter Score data. If you're not familiar in Net Promoter Score, you've probably been asked this question, even if you don't know what the term is. It's just, it's a way to gauge customer loyalty and satisfaction, just simply by asking how likely you are to recommend the product to somebody else. Just some considerations as you're using these remote usability tools. A lot of them now offer recruiting, but it's going to be an extra cost, probably. I don't know, maybe not all of them, but it's probably going to be an extra cost. So just investigate that before you propose it, because it'll impact your budget. And that's really all there is to start collecting some really valuable usability data. So now, when you look out at your sea of users, these people aren't strangers anymore, so you can empathize with them. And it's real empathy because you've actually got data on what it's like to be in their position, feeling frustrations, having goals, using your tool. And it not only helps you create a product that they will need, but also to build a really high quality user experience. Okay, so thanks for sticking with me this far, and thank you again to Tech Talent South for hosting. And at this point, I'm gonna invite Mary to come back on and help me sort through any questions that we might have gotten.
That was so great. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation. I saw we had a couple of folks raise hands. So for those who are still with us that had raised their hands, please type your question either into the chat or the Q&A. And I did see 2 questions come through so far. The first In addition to the screens, will we receive the webinar recording by email? Thank you in advance. So Molly, if you want to share the screens with me, or the slides rather with me, I'll share them in the follow-up email. We will be posting this recording to our YouTube channel. So if you want to watch it all again, you're welcome to. You could also share with other folks you think may enjoy this conversation and benefit from it. Any other resources you want to share as well, Molly, we can include in that follow-up email too.
Okay. I can share some like books or something.
Yeah, and
That's
even
helpful.
some of the sites you mentioned throughout and some of the tools that you personally like to use. Yeah, happy to include those as well. Next question. I really like your tip about how, what, etc. questions for user interviews. Are there questions you'd recommend we avoid? Common mistakes people make when doing user interviews?
I mean, the biggest one to avoid is, I'm building this, would you use it? Like that one is a really, or anything that looks, I mean, it's not going to be that obvious, but you'll find yourself like sneaking in questions about what you're building in much more subtle ways. And that's appropriate for when you're doing concept testing. But for that early stage that we were talking about, you just really want to scrub it out. People in big lean startup champions would say not to mention it at all. I'd say just at least leave it for the end.
Great. We have a couple of comments. Terrific info and thanks. Another question. Any quantitative textbooks you recommend?
Quantitative. So this is hard for me to say because I got my quantitative background in like biology class in college. So other than so no, I'm sorry.
Next question. Do you use empathy maps recently in creating user stories or personas? Frequently and not recently. Okay, so the question is, do you use empathy maps recently in creating user stories or personas?
No, I don't. I wish that we were all in a room together. I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, Tom, who submitted that question, if you have any comments or additional thoughts you'd like to share, please do. Another question. Hi, great talk. I'm curious how you get stakeholders to get on board with actually allowing time for user research in the tech time crunch and fast deadlines.
Well, so this is like the hardest thing because like the deadlines that people give you, I mean, sometimes they're arbitrary, but a lot of times they're lined up with some kind of an operational milestone that's really fixed. And so if there is some wiggle room there, then like I said, you sort of sell them on it, you know, tell them what the benefit is going to be. I mean, ultimately a higher ROI, you know, you'll know better where to focus your resources and you'll make better decisions about, you know, the implementation of your campaigns or whatever you're building. So that's the best way to sell them on it. It's it's different depending on whether you're like in a corporate environment or, you know, a freelancer or you're in an agency, but ultimately whoever you're trying to sell it on, just think about like what matters to them. And is this something that can make a difference in the metrics that they think about every day?
Great. A couple more comments. Thank you. This was so helpful. Great content. Very useful information. Thank you, Molly and Sean. I'm Mary. I'm under the guise of Sean, but thank you for attending. To Yogi, who commented that. Let's see. Another question we have. Thank you. I've always done moderated usability testing, and I'm now trying unmoderated remote testing due to current circumstances. Tried look back free trial. We had 0% response rates, which is much lower than usual for our participant pool, and was disappointing. Any tips on successful unmoderated testing and getting people to participate? I'm thinking of trying Loop 11 next in case it's a software tech barrier.
Well, Loop 11 just launched their own user research panel. So a lot of those tools have their own panel of people that they're bringing them through. So I would imagine that the recruitment rate varies highly between them, and I haven't used a bunch of the different ones. So unfortunately, I can't really tell you which one is the best for that. Sorry.
Let's see. Tom from earlier, he was talking about empathy maps, submitted another comment. Empathy maps are common in design thinking and product management teams, such as on what a user persona would say, think, do, and feel.
Okay, well, I mean, I just put that into the form of a narrative. I think maybe you were talking about like the visual layout of a marketing persona versus just putting it into sort of that short story format that I use. And I have used more sort of graphic formats with clients that had already done marketing personas, and so we just wanted to maintain the format that they were using. So yeah, I've used it, but it's not my preferred approach.
Another comments, and a question. Great talk, thank you. Do you use a persona template when creating personas during your user research? If so, what do you find to be the most valuable components of a good persona?
So it's so different from one project to another. And it's just, so I've actually gotten to the point where as far as a template goes, I will use a spreadsheet. I'll start with a spreadsheet, and then I'll decide what user attributes are relevant for this particular project, and I'll make those the columns, and then I'll fill in the cells for across each persona. Those are the rows, and then I'll sort of export that, and then I'll sort of fashion it into a narrative. So that's the closest I come to using any sort of a template. I feel like I'm not answering people's questions very well.
You are. Any tips on moderating brainstorming sessions with clients or internally?
So brainstorming, any tips on moderating brainstorming? So spend a lot of time planning for the meeting, make an agenda, even if you don't share it with them. I share it with them. So that you can just make it clear, look, these are all the things we're going to try to cover, and you can have an excuse to sort of move things along. So just like be really organized in your approach to planning meetings and spend time preparing for them is the main thing. And the other thing is, when you're just getting into doing interviews or focus groups or any kind of thing where you're collecting other people's open-ended feedback, it might seem a little awkward, and you might sort of always want to jump in and sort of like guide them in their answers, and just sort of shut your mouth and wait and let them sort of like, it's okay, and just let them have the space to open up. And it might be more space than feels comfortable, but just let them open up and fill the space. And it's okay for things to be silent for a little bit, and because when it gets rolling, then it's really good, you know. That would be my my tips for that.
Awesome. And I realized we had a couple come through the Q&A. I've been reading through the chat, so I'm going to hop over to these for a minute.
Okay.
How do you find interview subjects? What compensation or enticement do you use to offer for their participation?
Like you can use gift cards. That's mainly it, gift cards. But then a lot of these things, you may not have to. If you're doing interviews with internal stakeholders, of course, you know, you don't have to, and those can be really valuable too. But yeah, some kind of like mild, small compensation like that, nothing big.
And then how do you find the interview subjects?
Done everything, just like gone to the place, you know, like a big public place, and just like walked up and talked to people. Recruited people online, through forums, through social media. You can use a digital ad campaign. There are a variety of ways to take, and like I said, some of these remote research tools that you subscribe to actually have their own panel of testers that they provide compensation to.
Awesome. Next question. I work for a government agency, and we have a few grantees that develop tech services and tools, but do not incorporate user-centered design because they say they cannot fit it in the grant's project timeline. How do you recommend approaching this? Is there a lean way for them to incorporate it in their project plan?
Well, I mean, so I feel like compared to, you know, some agencies that use a much more involved approach than I am, that what I've described is the lean version. But qualitative research, especially, is like extremely flexible in terms of the scope that you're designing the scope of what your research is going to be. So you can make it as small or as large as you want. So that's the main thing that I would just say, is that don't look at the way that one agency says it, or the way that one textbook says it, and think, oh, that's insane, I'm never going to fit that in. You can always find ways to scale it down if there's any room at all. Sometimes there's just no room at all.
All right. Do you ever feel like creating the persona early narrows your research prematurely?
Well, that is the main sort of argument against it, that you're kind of like biasing yourself. But you know that you're gonna be, well, ideally you'll do some research later on, and because you're actually creating personas that are based on some amount of evidence, I feel like you're actually widening it, because otherwise when you make market personas and you're just shooting from the hip, then that's when you're operating on your own assumptions, and to me that's more narrow.
Let's see. Do you have any suggestions for getting participants to share sensitive or confidential information?
Well, you know, a lot of times you're going to have them sign some kind of form that, like, promises them confidentiality. So that might provide some degree of comfort. I've done this in the healthcare space, and so we're obviously complying with HIPAA there as well. So just reminding them that these structures are in place to protect them. And then also just like, people naturally open up over the course of the interview. So the more time that you can spend with somebody, the more open they're going to be. And just be extremely respectful and really communicate your curiosity and your respect.
Okay. A couple comments. Thank you. Another, thanks so much for this info. Very helpful and practical session. Much appreciated. And it looks like the last question. Is there a good NDA template that you use for user interviews?
So I will either use whatever the client already has in place, or I tend to get stuff from Rocket Lawyer. I tend to get a lot of help from Rocket Lawyer. So I don't have my own legal counsel. So I recommend you check out. There's a couple of different sort of lawyer as a service, legal as a service platforms now that you can go to get some valid templates for that kind of thing.
Awesome. We have one more. Thank you so much. And I will echo that, Molly. Thank you so much for your time, for putting this together. It was a great presentation, really informative. For everyone still tuned in and who's been with us for a whole hour now.
Thank you, Mary.
Yeah, our pleasure. And thanks to everyone who's tuned in. We're definitely going to share some resources in a follow-up email. We'll put this on our YouTube channel as well. So if you missed anything or want to watch it all again, we just got another thanks from Greenville, South Carolina. You're very welcome. More thanks are rolling in. We really appreciate you all being here. Again, this is Molly from Model Content. My name is Mary. I represent Tech Talent South. We'll definitely keep you posted about upcoming events and other opportunities in the training and talent acquisition space. But hope you all have a great night. And Molly, thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Mary. Have a good
night,
evening.
everyone. You too.